Good evening and welcome to Tuesday's Encounters in New York. This program is presented every Tuesday at 7 p.m. New York time. My name is Mark Beecher and I'll be your host tonight. My special guest tonight is Mr. Preston Dennett, a prolific investigator, researcher, and author on all UFO subjects. Preston began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family and friends were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. He has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He is a field investigator for Mutual UFO Network, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 29 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs. He has taught classes on various paranormal subjects and lectures across the United States. In addition to writing true nonfiction books about UFOs and the paranormal, Preston Dennett is also an award-winning science fiction writer. Tonight, Preston will be doing a presentation on his book, The Healing Power of UFOs. Good evening, Preston. Welcome to the program. You can just introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I've been in this field for almost 40 years now. I came in as a skeptic, found out that some members of my family had encounters, some friends, people I worked with. That prompted me to do more investigation. Found out, of course, the subject is real. I joined all the UFO groups I could find, like the Mutual UFO Network, became a field investigator, did research for about 10 years, writing about 30 articles before I put out my first book, which was about healings. And since then, I've been putting out a book on the average about one per year. And yeah, this is a subject I'm very passionate about. I take it very seriously. I think it's really important that people know the truth because there is a cover-up. And I'm very excited to talk about the UFO healing cases tonight.
Absolutely. And we're prepared for that if you want to begin your presentation. And then we may have many questions afterwards.
All right, that's fine. I do have a PowerPoint presentation with about 80 plus images I'd like to share. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because I do have a lot of information to share, but happy to answer questions. Hold on, let me just pull up the PowerPoint right now and make sure that this does in fact work. Okay, you should be able to see it.
Yes, we can.
All right, let me get to the first slide here, and I'll just begin. Yeah, tonight I'm very honored and happy to talk about UFO healing cases. You can define a healing case as someone who's experienced a physiological improvement as a result of a UFO encounter. And these healing cases really cover the gamut of illnesses, injuries, and conditions, as we'll see in just a moment. As I said, I got involved in this field back in 1986 as a pretty young man. I was 21 years old. This is the first article I ever wrote on UFOs, and really didn't look back after that, finding out that so many people I knew were having encounters and had actually kept them secret from me. I asked them why, and they said, well, you wouldn't have believed me. I was a diehard skeptic. That, of course, changed pretty quickly when I found out that this subject is real and many people I knew were having encounters. These are just some of the books I've written. I've also written books on various paranormal subjects because this is connected to the paranormal in many ways, such as precognition and Bigfoot even, mediumship, out-of-body experiences, levitation. But these are the UFO books I've written. Some of them, I'm still putting out new books. So again, this is something I do work very, very hard at. My first goal is always to help people who are having encounters. My second is really to figure out what's going on and to educate people on this subject. So the first book I wrote was UFO Healings, and it covered 100 plus cases. I was planning on just writing an article because I thought this would be an interesting subject that wasn't really being covered in the UFO community. certainly not in mainstream media. And I had just uncovered a case myself that I personally investigated. But when I just started doing research, I very quickly found well over 30 cases. So after a year of research, I uncovered more than 100. And that's how this book was born. And it made quite a splash. It got the cover of the MUFON UFO Journal, the Mutual UFO Network. And I really worked hard to publicize it. And finally, this subject started to get some of the attention that it really deserved. The UFO subject is a fringe subject in and of itself. The healing cases within the UFO subject really didn't get a whole lot of attention because it's sort of the fringe of the fringe. A lot of people who have these kinds of experiences don't report them whatsoever. In fact, I'll be generous and say 1 in 10 people who have an encounter report it. It's closer to 1 in 100. So any estimates as to how common this is vastly underreported. A lot of other people started writing about UFO healing cases. This is Virginia Aronson. She wrote a book called Celestial Healings, which outlines several more cases. Another gentleman, Peter Michaels, wrote a book, We Come as Friends. Up to this point, the subject of UFO contact had been portrayed very negatively as something that we should be worried about, that people were being experimented on and kidnapped against their will. And frankly, that's just not accurate. I've interviewed hundreds of people who've had direct contact, been taken on board, and 80 to 90% of them feel that this was a benevolent experience. It can be very frightening, especially in the beginning, somewhat traumatic. That's not unusual. But most people I talk to wouldn't trade their experiences for anything. Many have been healed. Many feel like they've gotten a lot out of their experiences. Here's another researcher, Adrian DeVere, who wrote a book about healing as well. And he uncovered a very important aspect, which is that many people who have contact, they themselves become interested in healing or may in fact develop healing abilities. This is a very strong pattern I've noticed. People become doctors or nurses or start doing Reiki or hands-on healing or herbal healing, alternative healing of many forms. So my point is healing is a big part of the UFO contact experience. And since putting out that first book, every single time, almost without exception, that I would speak on the radio or do a podcast or go to a convention, someone would come up to me and share their own encounter with being healed. So I started collecting quite a few more cases, and I had to put out a new edition of the first book, which outlines more than 300 cases. These are cases that reach back over 100 years and come from all over the world. I don't want to say every country on our planet, but really just about. The first person to ever write about UFO healing cases is British researcher, UK researcher Gordon Creighton, who wrote an article called Healing from UFOs in the Flying Saucer Journal. He outlined about 5 or 10 cases, one involving a gentleman who had jumped from a train, broke both his legs, and was immediately pulled on board a UFO and told by the ETs that they would heal him. It's just one of several cases he outlined. Bud Hopkins was a very prominent researcher until he passed, probably the leading so-called abduction researcher. And he never wrote about UFO healings. And I was very curious about this because he had investigated so many cases. So one day I met him at a convention in San Diego, California, and I asked him face to face, do you have any healing cases? And he said, oh yes, I get them regularly. And I'm very encouraged by them because this shows a positive aspect to ET contact that's not often covered. And what I found is that pretty much every major researcher out there, particularly those who focus on cases of direct contact, do have healing cases, almost without exception. This is David Jacobs, PhD. He's written a number of books, takes a somewhat negative viewpoint towards UFO contact, but nevertheless has reported about a dozen cases of healings of various kinds, everything from pneumonia to cancer to a little girl who was suffering from diphtheria, expected to die, but was pulled on board a craft and healed. So yeah, even he has healing cases. Of course, John Mack, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, very well-known UFO researcher who wrote a book called Abduction and outlined several cases of people who've been healed of heart conditions, cancer, and pneumonia, and more. Edith Fiore, PhD, she wrote a book called Encounters, and she's the first person with a PhD to write a book on this subject. And she said that healing cases are far more common than people realize. She said fully 50% of the people she worked with had a healing. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, did a statistical study and found about 10%. Personally, in my own files, it's closer to about 30%, though the free study was a very large study of people who have contact, also found about 50%. So definitely more common than people realize. Barbara Lamb, another leading researcher who's uncovered several cases. One involved two ladies who had a UFO come down in the field where they were driving. They got out of their car to look at it, and it swooped down towards them. So they started to run. It struck them with a beam of light. Well, one of the ladies had been suffering from chronic back pain. After being struck by this beam of light, her back pain went away. So she's outlined many other cases of healings as well. Brad Steiger, another prominent researcher, very prolific author, has uncovered several cases of healing, including a gentleman who was wheelchair bound, paralyzed, was pulled on board a craft and healed of his paralysis. Just one of many, many cases like this. Yvonne Smith has written a couple of books on this subject. She's very well known for hypnotizing people to recover missing time. She has at least a couple of cases, one involving a gentleman who was apparently diagnosed with the AIDS virus and had an encounter, and following that, his diagnosis was reversed. So she can't say for sure he was healed, but it certainly looks like it. This is Wendell Stevens, a very prominent and pioneering early researcher who's uncovered many, many cases of people who've been healed. Richard and Lee K. Boyland wrote a book called Positive Encounters with Extraterrestrials. It was one of the first books to portray this subject in a positive light. I wrote to him, and he confirmed some of the cases in his book and added some new ones involving healings. So if you look at all the researchers out there, you will find that a good number of them have healing cases. They're just not getting a whole lot of attention. Artie Six Killer Clark up here, Constance Clear, Ann Druffel has cases. Timothy Good has many, Bill Hamilton, Ray Hernandez. So many people have cases that it's just astonishing that this hasn't gotten more attention. Jim and Coral Lorenzen, Jacques Vallée. So let's talk a little bit about the onboard experience. When someone is taken on board a craft, according to several statistical studies, the most common experience is being physically examined. This is usually the scariest part for most people. This is the procedure that often causes people to label it as a negative experience because it can be unpleasant and it can be quite frightening. But what I find so interesting is that people often describe the interior of the UFO in medical terms, saying that they looked like they were laid out on an examination table and that the beings were wearing coats like doctors, and will often sometimes actually label the ETs as doctors. There's a very strong medical theme that runs through onboard encounters. People describe the craft as being extremely clean. So this, I think, is important. And as I was going through these healing cases, it became clear to me that ETs probably know a good deal more about the human body than we do ourselves, given the fact that many of the cases of healings do involve chronic conditions, healings of chronic conditions. And I'll put that in quotes because if they're being healed, clearly they're not chronic. Now, the healings can be done in many different ways, but the vast majority of cases involves the use of light in some way. This can be from a beam of light that comes out of a craft. It can be from a small handheld instrument that the ETs will hold and place over a person's body or place on a person's body. It can involve someone walking into a room that, with a tube perhaps, or a table that sends down light upon them. But their use of light, of the electromagnetic spectrum, is incredibly advanced. And well over 50% of the cases of healing involve the use of light. Medical evidence is a very important type of evidence. And in fact, in the MUFON Journal Handbook, the Investigator's Handbook, there's a chapter on medical evidence. It's actually titled Medical Injuries. So it's biased, and there's no mention whatsoever of healing cases. Trying to get that fixed, I have not been successful, but there are many people who can point to marks on their body, bruises, very healed up scars, this sort of thing, which they can relate directly to a UFO experience, and perhaps the insertion of an implant. There's quite a lot of talk and speculation about ET implants, foreign bodies that are placed in a person's body, often the sinus or the ear, but really anywhere, arms or legs. And there's been some speculation that these are for tracking or even mind control. But I can tell you, based on first-hand cases and contactees who've spoken directly to the ETs and asked them about the purpose for implants, that in the vast majority of cases, these are for healing. One lady I interviewed asked the ETs why they were implanting her, and they said this is to measure the level of pollution in your body. Another was told it's to boost your immune system. Another was told it's to monitor your vitals. So in many cases, it appears to be health related, to stabilize the person's health in some way. Now, there is a lot of talk about medical evidence and particularly injuries. And I looked into it, and yes, it does happen. It's not as common as healings. And in most of these cases, it seems to be accidental. Not always. This is the case involving Elaine Thomas, Mona Stafford, and Louise Smith, who had a pretty harrowing onboard encounter in Kentucky. And all three suffered what we would probably label as a mild form of radiation sickness. That's pretty darn rare. The most common type of, quote, injury that a person experiences is eye irritation, which often heals up. I can tell you I've got a lot of cases of eye healing, as I will explain shortly. Here is Denise Bishop. She's a lady from England who stepped outside her home and saw a UFO. It sent out this thin beam of light which struck her hand, and she was temporarily paralyzed. The beam retracted, the craft moved off, but her hand hurt afterwards, and it developed a burn. It got worse, so she went to the doctor who diagnosed it as a laser burn. So this is medical evidence. Another very famous case is Stephen Michalik, a prospector from Canada who walked up to a landed UFO, and it took off, blasted him with hot air, and he was diagnosed with headaches, nausea, vomiting, hives, burn marks on his chest. His blood lymphocyte level dropped dramatically. It looks very much, he was examined by 30 or 40 doctors who could not account for his illness other than it was some form of radiation sickness. Number of cases where people walk up to a landed UFO and have this problem. But as I said, much more common are healing cases. I have documented more than 300, but it's since then probably about doubled. And again, most people don't report it, especially if it's a healing. The most healings take place in different places. Sometimes ETs will come into a person's home, often into their bedroom, and enact a healing there. One really interesting case involved that of Jim Law from Gainesville, Florida, who was suffering from a hernia. And his encounters were quite frightening. He had the Greys come into his room and he asked them, he says, if you're going to take me, why don't you heal my hernia? He was scheduled for an operation just a week or two away. And they said, and I quote, we know of this condition that you speak of, and we will repair it. And they did. It took them less than a minute using a handheld instrument. And after it was completed, this was a successful healing. He asked them, why are you taking me? And they told him, and again I quote, we are interested in your genetic potential to live a long time. He certainly found this fascinating because his grandfather was 105 years old. He had aunts who were in their 90s. He's got a lot of longevity in his family. And this is a pattern I've noticed with contactees. They often enjoy excellent health way into their golden years. So yeah, they will visit you in your home. Just as common, about 25 are visited in the home, 25% or so, 20. Just as common are people who have an encounter while walking outside or driving, and a UFO will hover overhead and perhaps send down a beam of light, or perhaps not. I mean, there was a gentleman who was rushing to the hospital to treat his kidney stones when a UFO hovered overhead, circled around the car 4 times. His pain completely disappeared. And when he got to the hospital, they could not find his kidney stones. He had been cured. He was not taken on board. He was not struck with a beam of light. I don't know how they did it, but apparently they have this ability because there are a number of cases like this. 50% of the cases of people who are healed, particularly if it's a serious condition, they're taken directly on board a craft and given some kind of operation, very much in the manner we do with today's doctors in hospitals. There is sometimes surgery involved. Sometimes it's not invasive. It's just using instruments that people have a lot of difficulty describing, strange instruments that we really have no parallel to here to describe, but again, often using lights. Almost all the cases involving cures of cancer, and I have over 30 documented, are people who were taken on board. In a small minority of cases, some people are given medicine. This is quite rare, but it certainly does happen. This can be a solve, these can be pills, or this might be orally consumed as a liquid of some kind. And I found something that really shocked me. About 10%, 10 to 15% of the cases of people who've been healed took place inside hospitals. I was really surprised to find this, but for one or two cases, I would have dismissed it, but it's not, it's dozens. People will be in their hospital room and someone will walk in and heal them. I've got so many cases of this coming from all over the world. Here's an illustration of a case in which a UFO hovered over the Cowichan State Hospital in Canada. Here's the witness, Doreen Kendall. This object was hovering over the children's wing. There was no encounter that was directly tied to this in terms of a healing or anyone in the hospital seeing it, but I suspect something probably did happen. This is the hospital where this UFO was hovering directly over. Quite a few cases of UFOs hovering over hospitals, and I think it's related to this aspect of healings. So let's get into some of the more interesting cases. This is a case involving two police officers, Officer McCoy and Officer Good, were driving through Damon, Texas. This is in 1954, I believe, 56. At any rate, they saw this UFO hovering over the field along the highway. It was quite large. There's a drawing of it here at the top of the screen. There's the field to the lower right, and you can see the officers here on the lower left. And as they're looking at this object, trying to identify it, it sent down a violet, a purple beam of light, which played across the field and suddenly struck them. Now, one of the officers had his arm hanging outside of the window of the police cruiser. This officer had been bitten by his son's baby pet alligator a few days earlier, which left a wound that was not serious, but certainly painful and swollen. It was all bandaged up. Well, as soon as this beam of light hit him, he said he could feel it. It was warm and tingling. It scared the living daylights out of them. They were quite frightened. They drove off well over the speed limit and raced away from this object and parked at a diner to talk about what they had seen. And that's when Officer Good realized that he was no longer experiencing any pain in his finger. So he took the bandage off, and the wound was completely healed. So there's something about these beams of light that have the ability to heal flesh wounds. And as near as I can tell, what it's actually doing is accelerating the natural healing process that our own body does. So it's not magical or by any means. I think they're using methods that, with light, that we have yet to fully understand. Jacques Vallée is a very prominent researcher. He investigated a case involving a medical doctor in France who saw a UFO hovering outside his home. This craft turned on its side and flashed him with a beam of light. It quite frightened him. He was left dazed and a little bit confused and stumbled into his bed, fell asleep, woke up the next morning with this mark on his abdomen. His son had the same mark on his abdomen. But even more astonishing is he was cured of two conditions. Prior to this, he had suffered injuries sustained in the Algerian War years earlier, which left him partially paralyzed. He was a professional piano player as well. He had to give up piano playing. But following this incident, his paralysis was completely gone. Also, very interesting is a few days before this incident, he was outside cutting wood with an axe. The axe slipped and gashed his foot. He had a pretty nasty wound on his ankle. Following this incident, the wound was completely gone. A good number of the cases, about 10 to 20%, involve healings of multiple conditions. This is Timothy Green Beckley. He's outlined a number of cases. One involved a well-known journalist by the name of Brandon Blackman, who was with a crowd of people in Prospect Park, New York, when a UFO showed up. 20 or 30 people saw it. They watched it for about 10, 15 minutes until it darted off. Now, Brandon Blackman had a cut on his hand. When he got home, he found out that the cut on his hand had been healed. Again, he was not taken on board. He had no missing time. He wasn't struck by a beam of light. Sometimes just being in the presence of a UFO can affect a healing. I have many, many cases of healings of flesh wounds. People who might have been assaulted, people who might have broken a bone, gotten burned, or this sort of thing are healed. Probably 20 or 30 cases of this. Here's another really interesting case because it's quite unusual. Sergeant Charles Moody was in Alamogordo, New Mexico, when a UFO landed right next to him. These ETs, as you can see right here at the top, came out. This is one of the early cases prior to this subject becoming well known. And he drew these ETs very much like Travis Walton, a very well-known contactee, did. And he was pulled on board. Now, he resisted. This was not a pleasant experience for him initially. In fact, he tried to shoot at the ETs, was not successful, was pulled on board the craft, and during this struggle, he injured his back. Now, the ETs calmed him down, told him, "We're not here to hurt you." This is the first thing they always tell people. It's very significant. They always tell people, "Do not be afraid. We're not here to hurt you." And this is demonstrably true. Then they proceeded to heal him of the injuries he had sustained during this encounter. A very small minority of cases, about 5%, involve a healing of injuries sustained during an encounter. He proceeded to have a very pleasant experience where they showed him the engine room, gave him all kinds of information, told him he would have further contact, and then he disappeared off the UFO scene. But it's another interesting case of someone healed of a flesh wound. Injuries are a very common category of the types of conditions that are being healed. This is a gentleman, Richard Rilke, who you'd probably call a UFO contactee, in that he perceives his experiences as being wholly benevolent. They're with human-looking ETs. As a young child, he had a sledding accident where his ear became infected and he was going deaf. He had contact with human-looking ETs who healed him. Later, as an adult, he was in a factory working and crushed his finger, went to the nurse, who was horrified. She said, "I can't help you. You need to go to the emergency room. Be prepared because you're probably going to lose this finger." It was completely smashed. He went to the hospital and was awaiting treatment. And this is when his ET friends showed up, used a handheld flashlight-like device, held it over his finger and cured it. He was released from the hospital. They thought he had faked it. But when he went to work the next day, the factory nurse, was surprised to see him. And she could not believe it when he showed her his finger, which was completely healed. Because, yeah, she thought he would lose it. His case is pretty well verified. At one point, he developed a tumor on his forehead, which was viewed by more than 50 people. And again, this was healed by the ETs and verified by everyone who knew him. Another case involving a contactee is Jerry Wills, who's quite well known in the UFO field. He's on the lecture circuit. He does healings for people. He had a lot of contact as a young man where a human-looking ET taught him all about science, mathematics, astronomy, psychic abilities. At one point as a child, he developed a very severe fever. He had little gray ETs actually come in and heal him. I found, after looking at all the healing cases, over 50% are done by grays. Then there's, of course, human-looking ETs. Mantids also do healings. I got a couple reptilian cases as well, and strange humanoids of all different kinds, whether it's little blue beings or tall whites or short little dwarf-like beings. All different types of ETs are doing these healings. Leonard Stringfield is a very well-known and very well-respected researcher. Mostly concentrates on UFO crash retrieval reports. However, he does have a few healing cases. The one that impressed me most involved a 12-year-old boy by the name of Chuck Doyle from Florence, Kentucky. He had stepped out his home into the backyard and saw a manta ray-shaped UFO hovering over his neighbor's yard, sending down a beam of light onto their pool. He was fascinated, trying to identify it. It was quite close. It sent down this beam of light, and it started to play across the field and come towards him. And he realized this beam of light was about to hit him. So he turned to run, and it struck him. And the second this beam of light hit him, he was unable to move. He said he was running at a 45-degree angle and was basically hanging over the ground, absolutely unable to move, essentially being levitated. As soon as this beam of light hit him, he said it was like being doused with a bucket of ice water, but all these strange images started flowing through his head. Weird landscapes, weird structures, geometric shapes, mathematical symbols. They were apparently communicating with him. It was very brief. The beam retracted. He fell down, got up, ran into the house, told his mom, who ran outside just in time to see this craft moving off. But what's interesting about this case is at the time of this encounter, Chuck was suffering from a very serious head cold. He was quite congested, but following this encounter, his cold was gone. And in fact, they took him to the doctor who verified this cure. It's one of about a dozen cases I have of people cured of colds, flus, and minor infections of various kinds. This is Jim Sparks. He wrote a very interesting, I think 2 books actually, about his own personal encounters. And he is unusual because he has fully conscious encounters. He never needed to use hypnosis. He remembered them all fully consciously of being taken on board and interacting with gray type ETs. At one point, he was suffering very badly from the flu. He said ETs showed up and they started to chastise him for not going to the hospital. They said he was near death and they promised to intervene if he ever got into trouble. They reminded him of this and they proceeded to cure him of his flu. He's had a lot of really interesting encounters. At one point, he was taken on board and given what is often ridiculed in this field, the anal probe. I did a lot of research on that aspect. This is, I think, just a simple uh, colonoscopy, if you will. There's not a whole lot of cases of it. It's been gotten far too much attention because I think the media loves a lurid story. But frankly, there aren't a whole lot of cases. And he asked them why they were doing this. And they told him he's eating far too much meat. He was pretty much purely a carnivore. They told him he needed to cut down on meat, which he did. He still ate poultry and fish, but stopped eating so much red meat. And it was a short time later he was taken on board, given the same procedure. And he asked them, why are you doing this? I stopped eating so much meat. And they said, yes, we know, and it's helping. He's not the only person who's been given dietary advice by ETs. There was another case, which is very interesting, involving a lady who was suffering from renal failure. She hadn't gone to the bathroom for a few days, went to the doctor. He was horrified and said, you should have gone to the emergency room days ago. You're suffering kidney failure. You need to go right now. This is life-threatening. So instead of driving directly to the emergency room, which she should have, she went home to alert her family, her friends, and her employer, telling them all that she was very sick, to please pray for her, that she's going directly to the emergency room. But after she hung up on the phone with them, she laid down in bed and fell unconscious and woke a short time later to find her bed surrounded by short, brown-skinned humanoids. Not grays as we would think of them, just short, bald humanoids with dark skin. And they were massaging her abdomen. And she was going in and out of consciousness. She couldn't fully wake up, but finally she did. And she woke up and immediately went to the bathroom, immediately went back to her doctor, and asked him to check her out again. And he did. And he was completely baffled. These healing cases leave a long line of baffled doctors. Some are quite upset, actually, and accuse the patients of all kinds of things. But he had no explanation and told her, well, I don't know what to tell you. Perhaps I misdiagnosed you, which clearly wasn't the case because her condition was very serious. He asked her what happened, and she said, I think I was visited by angels. And this is what she told everybody. However, she knew it wasn't angels. They didn't look like angels. And it was about a month later, she was pulled on board a craft, examined in a small round room by these same little beings who put her on a table and used this device, which I've heard many people describe and certainly read about. It's sort of this metal uh, slab or little sort of, I don't know how to describe it. These instruments are very hard to describe because, again, there's no correlation to the equipment we have, but it was essentially an X-ray device which projected the inside of the body in full living color in a hologram. And they showed her her kidneys. Said, look, your kidneys are doing really well. And she agreed. They looked completely healthy. And they moved it over her body and showed her her liver. And they said, do you see all these black spots? And she said, yes. They said, this is because you are drinking far too much Diet Cola. You need to stop drinking Diet Cola. It's damaging your liver. So she obviously did. But yeah, it's another case of people who are given dietary advice. Jim Sparks was also a heavy smoker. I loved smoking cigarettes. He was pulled on board once, and the ETs handed him this vial, a glass-looking vial or box filled with this stinky, really bad smelling black goo. They said, "This is our gift to you." And they showed him an image of him looking very unhealthy. And he said, "I don't understand. What kind of gift is this?" And they said, "We pulled this out of your lungs. You need to stop smoking. You are uh, very unhealthy because of it." And he did. He stopped smoking. It's really interesting because I found another case that's almost identical to that. The only real difference was the shape of the container that was shown to the gentleman. It was round, whereas I think in Jim Sparks' case, it was more of a box. And that same gentleman was taken on board again, and the ETs told him, "You need to stop smoking marijuana. This is not the life that we had planned for you." So yeah, another case of people being given dietary advice. There's a case from Edith Fiore, PhD, who I showed earlier, who had 50% of the people she's interviewed be healed. She interviewed two sisters who were both healed of yeast infections. They said they were taken on board and they saw many people being healed. One being healed of paralysis, another who was healed of intestinal worms. One of the ladies, the ETs told her that she had breast cancer. She was not aware of this. There's a small minority of cases who people are told that they're sick or will develop an illness that has not yet been diagnosed. But they proceeded to cure her. Here's the type of being that she saw, and here's the instrument that they used to cure her. I talked to one gentleman, he was taken on board, and the ETs told him, "You have a brain tumor." And he told them, "I'm fine. I'm feeling fine." And they said, "You won't be. You will develop, severe problems if we don't take care of it." And asked him if it's all right if they took care of it. And he, of course, said yes. So yeah, that sort of thing does happen. But in most cases, people are already suffering from an illness. And in fact, often they're scheduled for surgery sometimes the next day. I call it the last minute phenomena. ETs will wait to the last moment before treating a person prior to them having surgery. So many different types of cases. I've got several cases of dental healings. Here's Ventura Maceres. He's an elderly gentleman from, I believe it's Brazil. Any rate, he had a UFO hover overhead. He saw the type of humanoid you see here. It's a very well verified case with landing traces and multiple witnesses. And what's really interesting about this case is after being struck by this beam of light, he started to grow a third set of teeth. Unless you think this is apocryphal or not verified, it isn't. It's very well verified. He was interviewed by government officials, police officers, UFO researchers, and doctors. Over 50 people interviewed him and verified this healing. The ETs told him that they have the ability to cure cancer as well. Another case involving a dental healing involves a gentleman by the name of Daniel from West Virginia. I got this case from journalist Bob Tietz, who wrote a book called West Virginia UFOs. It's one of the few cases I have of someone who asked for a healing and got it. Daniel was taken on board, and he was suffering from an impacted wisdom tooth, and he asked them, "Can you heal this?" And they said, "Yes, we will heal you," and did. And his wisdom tooth was no longer infected. That's pretty rare. I do know of one case of a lady who was diagnosed with cancer. That evening, she and her husband lay in bed crying and praying to God. And that night, she was pulled on board and only has a vague memory of being on a table surrounded by gray type ETs, but went to the doctor shortly later, and there was no trace of the cancer. Many, many cases of eye healing, eye doctors from, I'm not sure where the ETs are from, but I think they're from other planets. I do think we're dealing with ETs in the classic sense, people from other planets. A very famous case from Ralph and Judy Bloom involved a Peruvian customs official who stepped out onto his veranda, his patio, saw a saucer-shaped craft quite some distance high up in the sky, it sent down a purple beam of light which struck him on the face and chest. He, at the time, wore very thick glasses. He suffered from myopia, nearsightedness. Following this incident, he had to throw away his glasses because he could not see through them. His vision had gone back to normal. At the time, he also suffered from rheumatism, chronic rheumatism, and that cleared up over the space of a week. It's another case involving someone who is cured of multiple conditions. Many cases involving people who are healed of eye problems, whether it's detached retina. I interviewed one lady who was cured of glaucoma by praying mantis ETs. She went back to her ophthalmologist who couldn't believe it because her optic nerve, which had thinned dangerously, she was going blind, had thickened up to almost normal, and her sight largely returned. It wasn't perfect, but she had gone camping with her husband when she had a praying mantis encounter, and she could feel them doing something to her. And yeah, this cured her of glaucoma. The gentleman here is a contactee. He's very well known. And he was stationed on Okinawa. His name is Howard Menger. And he was stationed on Okinawa in 1945 during the World War and suffered eye injuries when a shell exploded near him, and he got fragments in his eye, and his eye became infected. The infection spread to both eyes, and he went totally blind. Doctors did not expect him to recover, but while he was convalescing in the hospital tent on the island, a nurse came into his room and started speaking with him and said that he had very important work to do in the future and that she would heal him, and applied a salve or a lotion to his eyes. Very quickly, his infection cleared up and his eyesight returned. The doctors were amazed, and later he was taken on board and heard this same nurse talking and recognized her voice. And she confirmed that, yes, she was the one who came to the hospital tent. He asked the doctors, the army doctors, who was that nurse? They denied the presence of any nurse going into his hospital tent. Here's another case. These two ladies were interviewed by Bud Hopkins. They wrote an interesting book. I highly recommend it, called Connections. They're not particularly happy about their encounters. They feel it's quite traumatic, but both were healed of poor eyesight. One of the ladies here was pulled on board and told by the Greys that she was eating far too many fatty foods. She has become slightly overweight and that she needed to cut down on eating fatty foods. She was not happy to be called fat by the Greys, but this is another case of ETs giving dietary advice and looking out for the welfare of people. And by the way, it's not just physical illnesses. I have people who are cured of mental depression as well. 3 or 4 cases. One guy absolutely had suicidal ideation, was planning on committing suicide, actually had gone out to the desert with a gun and was going to end his life when he had an encounter with Greys. And he said following that, his suicide tendencies went away. One gentleman I interviewed was very suicidal and having all kinds of lung problems, was struck by a beam of light, and he said his lung problems went away, his depression went away, and he started becoming very psychic as well. This is another pattern I see. Here's another really well-known case from England involving a police officer, Alan Godfrey, who came upon a UFO hovering over the road, had missing time, and under hypnosis did recall being taken on board, despite the fact that numerous people called the police station where he worked reporting UFOs, and the surrounding area, other police stations were receiving calls. He was ridiculed mercilessly by fellow officers and his superiors. And in fact, they took away his police car and gave him a bicycle. It got so bad he eventually resigned. But it was some time later that he and his wife were in bed, and she woke up to hear this very loud buzzing noise over the house. She could not wake him up for the life of her. He would not wake up. And then she fell asleep. And the next morning they became intimate. And this was interesting because prior to this, Alan Godfrey, the police officer, had been assaulted by a criminal and injuries sustained left him infertile. He was not able to have children. But that morning, following this weird incident with the buzzing noise over their house, he and his wife became intimate and she got pregnant. And he was so upset about it, thinking he's impotent, that he can't have children, that he accused her of sleeping around, which she denied. They ended up going to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, I don't know how to explain this, but your condition of infertility has been reversed. I've got about 5 or 10 cases of that as well. I love this case. This is a very well verified case involving a hunter and oil field worker by the name of Carl Higdon from Rawlins, Wyoming, who was out hunting elk when a UFO landed next to him. He saw a pretty much human-looking ET. It was a very small craft. He was pulled on board. Inside it was huge, much bigger on the inside than on the outside. He saw some elk there in glass cages. He saw quite a few things. They ended up apparently taking him to their planet. It's quite an extensive encounter. And then he was returned. They found his truck out in the middle of a field with no tire tracks around it. Other people in the area saw UFOs. He had only vague memories of this and recalled some of it under hypnosis. But interesting here is that prior to this encounter, he was suffering from chronic kidney stones. Also, his lungs were severely scarred from an earlier bout with tuberculosis. Following this encounter, the scarring on his lungs was gone, and his kidney stones had been completely cured. Quite a few cases of people cured of kidney stones. Here's another. This case comes from Constance Clear, involving a gentleman from Texas by the name of Andrew, who was pulled on board, and the ETs were examining him and said, what are these things in your kidney? Are they supposed to be there? And Andrew said, no, they're not. And in fact, if you leave them in there, I will be very sick. And they said, well, we will remove them for you. And they did. And he drew this whole incident, this instrument that was used. Well, Constance Clear took the drawing to a doctor who immediately recognized the equipment and said, yes, this is exactly how we cure kidney stones. So a really interesting case. This medical evidence is absolutely astonishing and basically proves the reality of these cases. This is Bill Hamilton. I corresponded and met with him many times. He's a very good researcher, and he interviewed a lady from Southern California who prefers to remain anonymous, who was diagnosed with a cyst in her breast. She was going to have it removed. Prior to having it removed, she had a UFO encounter. This cyst was diagnosed on X-rays. She went to the doctor and to have it removed, and they could not find the cyst. So this is another very well verified case. And I have one that's very, very similar. It was my first healing case involving a contactee who I know quite well. In fact, she showed me UFOs twice, so I know for a fact that her case is legitimate. She was diagnosed with a tumor in her fallopian tubes and had MRI imaging. She was having a lot of pain from it, bleeding. It was a real problem. She was scheduled for surgery, and the night before surgery, she had ETs enter into her room. They were gray type ETs. She's had encounters her whole life. She said that all of her encounters have been very benevolent, though very, very frightening at first. And she remembers being held by them as a little child and nurtured, taught how to do psychic abilities, quite a few encounters. As an adult, it became quite frightening for her. But over time, as she overcame her fear, she realized they're not trying to hurt her. So she went to the hospital to have her surgery, and the doctors, as they always do, did pre-imaging to make sure that everything was still in order, and could not find her tumor, and accused her of having gone to another hospital and had surgery, which she, of course, denied. And they told her, you're lying. We know you've had surgery. And they showed her her MRI, and there was fluid there in her fallopian tube, no tumor. And they said, this fluid is only present if surgery has happened. And again, she denied it. I asked her about it. I'm like, why didn't you just tell the doctors? She said, are you kidding? I didn't want to be, taken away by the men in white coats and put into a mental hospital, which I have to say is probably wise because I've talked to two people who did make the mistake of telling people, and they were institutionalized by their own family. So this is unfortunately a danger, but it's another very well verified case. She also developed healing abilities. She healed someone of gestational diabetes. She also was contacted by some friends of hers whose child was in a coma. She went there, did her sort of hands-on healing, and he woke up out of his coma. She actually did a healing on me. I wasn't ill, but she asked me if I wanted to experience energy work. And she laid her hands on my bare feet and pushed energy up through my feet. And I could physically feel it. I've done this with another contactee who was healed of eczema during her encounter, and she did the same thing. And I saw blue light, blue and pink pastel light coming out of her hands. So this is a pattern that we see often with contactees. They develop the ability to do healing. Chris Bledsoe is another very well-known contactee who was healed of Crohn's disease. He was on so much medication that he had to carry it around with him. He was taking dozens of pills daily. His condition was quite severe. He was basically wheelchair bound, but after being pulled on board a craft, which he didn't remember a whole lot of what happened, he never had to take medication again and is now still on the lecture circuit, and I believe is due to testify before Congress next, in a couple of weeks about his case. He has an enormous amount of evidence to support it. Another case I found, which I found super interesting, occurred in England, in Durham, England, to Fred White. And he was diagnosed with a hole in his heart and was about to have surgery when a gentleman walked into his room who was quite exotic looking, dressed strange, had very large hypnotic eyes, was basically human looking, had this weird device on his wrist, which wasn't a watch. It did not have any dials or numbers on it. But this gentleman proceeded to say, "We are very interested in your work with electronics." Fred White was an inventor who worked with electronics. And they said, "Your work is very important. You need to continue it. We will heal you." And proceeded to heal him very quickly. His pain went away. He was able to breathe clearly. And this figure walked out through the front door. Shortly later, the doctors came in to wheel him into surgery. Fred White refused to go to surgery. They said, he told them, "You need to do the imaging again." They said, "We're not doing that. We just did it. You have a hole in your heart. This is serious. You need surgery now." And he said, "No, I'm not doing it. I'm breathing fine. I have no pain. I want the imaging done again." And they did it again and could find no hole in his heart. This is one case that started to really answer my question as to who is being healed and why, which I'll get to in a second. This is an illustration done by a contactee by the name of Katarina Wilson from Oregon, who had lightning. She was in Florida, visiting Florida, and was a victim of a near lightning strike. It knocked her to the ground, knocked her unconscious. She got up, she stumbled inside and was immediately pulled on board. And the Greys told her that the lightning strike had severely damaged her heart and they will fix it, which they did. She said it was quite painful, actually. She later went to the doctor and they found no evidence of any operation, no evidence of any heart damage. This is the case which really started to answer my question as to who's being healed and why. This is John Hunter Gray. He works as a social worker fighting against discrimination against Native Americans. He's a Native American, and he's middle-aged, was driving with his son through Richland Center, Wisconsin, when he had a typical missing time encounter, remembered it without the aid of hypnosis, just spontaneously in the days that followed, as did his son. He remembered being pulled on board. There were Greys. They gave him injections, or what he thought was injections, in a few parts of his body. And following this, he experienced what I could only term as a health upgrade. Because while he had no illness, He grew another 2 inches. His feet increased a couple of inches in size. He started growing a lot more hair again, 5 o'clock shadow. His nails started growing at twice the rate. He lost weight. He was a little bit overweight. Scars that he had carried for years healed up. He documented over 20 different health improvements. Said he never got colds or flu after that again, ever in his life. So this is one of many cases. And I'm like, well, this is interesting. I wonder why he was healed. There's another case from Edith Fiore involving a young man who had angioma. Angioma is a malformation of the blood vessels in the brain. It can be minor and it can be very, very serious and life-threatening. And in his case, it was life-threatening. He started to lose his ability to talk, which he did. He started going blind and was no longer able to walk. So doctors basically said, there's not a whole lot we can do. He will probably pass away. And suddenly his condition mysteriously and miraculously reversed. They couldn't figure it out. In fact, it was so miraculous that they ordered exploratory surgery, brain surgery, and opened up his head and found out that he no longer had angioma. Years later, under hypnosis, he recalled that he was, in fact, taken on board and healed of the malformation of the blood vessels in his brain. Here's a little drawing that he did of the types of devices used. They can open a person's body like a zipper and close it right up, leaving no scar whatsoever. And again, they're often using handheld instruments that people have a real hard time describing. Here's one of the ETs he said he saw. Very unusual. Cases coming from all over the world. There was a whole bunch of cases in the Georgia area of Russia involving a wide variety of cures. You name it. People were basically super excited when the UFOs would show up and hoping that they would be taken on board. One kid was cured of chronic liver disease. So my point is these cases are definitely worldwide. Here's a family who wrote a book about their encounters, which started out somewhat traumatic. And as it continued, they realized, no, this is not any reason to be afraid. And their encounters became very interactive and fully conscious. And each member of the family was healed at one time. The father, he slipped when he was on board the UFOs, hurt his back. They healed him of that. The mother was cured of cesarean scars. The son was diagnosed with asthma and had it very badly and was treated by the ETs for that. Here's a gentleman who I spoke with personally, Sisto Paz Wells. He's very well known for being able to call down UFOs for the media and has done that so successfully on numerous occasions, has proved his encounters over and over and over again. He's still active in the field. He was doing a UFO stakeout in Sebago Cabins, New York, with a group of people. UFOs showed up as they often do. One of the gentlemen who had joined that stakeout, this little, venture, was a professional dancer who had to give up dancing because he developed arthritis in his legs. In fact, his legs were so swollen, he had a lot of trouble walking. Well, in the middle of the night, something came into his cabin, some sort of being, a glowing being. He doesn't really remember much. Woke up the next morning with his pajama bottoms off of his body, put them back on, and that's when he realized his legs were no longer swollen. So he attributes his encounter to fixing his arthritis. Quite a few cases of people healed of arthritis. This is Cynthia Hind. She's best known for her book, UFOs Over Africa, detailing many, many cases. She interviewed a mother and daughter who were taken on board, and the daughter was suffering from jaundice, hepatitis, which was chronic, and they healed her of that. I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly here. This case is so interesting. I interviewed this gentleman personally. His name is Reverend Michael Carter. He had developed a blood clot in his leg. His leg swelled up to twice its normal size. He went to the doctor. The doctor was very upset. You told him you should have come in much earlier. This condition is life-threatening. You could drop dead at any second. We need to monitor you very closely. Gave him a cocktail of medicines to take and told him that he had to come in on a pretty much weekly basis to check his progress. Went home, and it was a short time later, a week or two, that he woke up to his room filling with light, and there was a human-looking ET, 6.5 feet tall, very muscular, wearing a jumpsuit, who held out its hand and shot him with a beam of light. There was no tool involved. About 10% of the cases don't involve technology as we would think of it, but rather a hands-on healing, a psychic healing. That's what happened to him. He said this beam of light dazzled him to the degree that he fell unconscious, woke up the next morning, and his leg was of normal size. And in fact, it looked like his veins and arteries had been rerouted to some degree. He went to the doctor. The doctor was absolutely astonished, asked him what happened. And like most people, Reverend Carter said, "Just be happy for me." Didn't want to talk about it. But after interviewing this gentleman, I interviewed another lady from Norway who was healed of chronic back pain. Most of the people I'd interviewed have a history of encounters, and that's certainly true of Michael Carter. But some people don't. 50% of the people who are healed have a history of encounters. Many of them are profoundly psychic. But these healings are evenly divided between men and women. It can happen to people who are very young, people who are quite elderly. I interviewed a man who was cured of swollen prostate. He was in his late 70s. Another lady from England had hepatitis. She was in her late 70s. So I'm not sure why they're healing some of these people. I couldn't figure it out. So I'm talking to this lady from Norway who had Grays come into her room and heal her of chronic back pain. And she had no history of encounters, which really puzzled me. And finally, I asked her what she did for a living. And she said, she's a retired artist, but she's very active in her community for fighting for human rights and animal rights. She told me, please don't use my name because I'm very well known. Well, Michael Carter was commended by President Clinton for his fight against racism. I started looking back through my files, and it was a real aha moment because the people who are being healed, almost without exception, are people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity. By that, I mean a lot of doctors, nurses, teachers, artists, musicians, environmentalists, social workers, this sort of thing, police officers. So I think, well, I had one couple that I interviewed who asked them flat out, why did you heal us? The gentleman was healed of a bad knee and carpal tunnel syndrome. And they told them, we are helping those who help others. They asked him, why don't you just come down and fix things? And they said, we can't do that. It's against karmic laws. You need to solve your own problems. This has come up in several cases. Just a few more cases I'd like to talk about. Here is a gentleman who's a contactee on the left. He's a hospital doorman. And when a person in the hospital had a cerebral aneurysm, a young boy who was very popular, the doctors asked if João Valerio, pictured here, could ask the ETs if they could heal him. So he did ask them, here's what they look like. And they said, yes, we will do our best, and gave him this substance, which is very much the appearance of raw brown sugar. It was crystalline form. It melted at body temperature. The ETs told João Valerio to give it to the doctors and have them rub it directly onto the patient's skin, which they did, and it was absorbed, and his circulatory system experienced a dramatic healing. The kid came out of a coma. He was apparently healed. They did save a portion of this substance for chemical analysis. Wendell Stevens, the researcher, spent thousands of dollars to have it analyzed, and the only result was that it was chemically unique. So I'm going to wrap it up here, but I do want to say that few more things. Many cases of people healed of cancer. There was one lady from Florida who was basically on her deathbed. The ETs pulled her on board a craft and they told her that her friend had requested a healing for her. Her friend was a contactee. So some of the cases of people who are healed are friends of contactees. And they proceeded to do a fairly painful operation and told her, stop taking any medicine that the doctors give you, just drink water. And she did. She was riddled with cancer. It started out as pancreatic cancer, which is a very serious form of cancer and not a high survivability rate, but they cured her. Here is Lynn Plaskett, a councilwoman from Florida who was diagnosed with lymphoma, had a small kind of UFO enter her bedroom, went around her bed, she levitated. She felt a real sense of benevolence from this thing and thought this was a good sign. Maybe this will help her illness. And it did. She was cured of lymphoma. Another gentleman I interviewed, Jim Schaefer, had a lymphoma on his neck, a bone hard tumor, and was going to have it removed when this orb showed up. And he actually filmed it as it appeared and went right into his body. You can find the film of this on the internet. Here's a still frame of it. And when he woke up the next morning, he fell asleep after this orb went into his body, went to the bathroom, and this tumor was gone. Went to the doctor for his operation, told them exactly what happened. He was very upfront with them. And they couldn't find any cancer. They did find necrotic tissue, did the operation, removed the necrotic tissue, and basically couldn't say that ETs healed him because they don't know, but said spontaneous remission. Ray Hernandez is very popular in this field. His dog, Nina, was healed of arthritis. I've got several cases involving pets who are healed. This is Joy Davies and her dog. She suffered from arthritis, as so did her dog. She's from Pennsylvania. Went for a walk in the forest behind her house, came upon a landed UFO, was taken on board, doesn't remember much except seeing this ball of light. Next thing she knows, she's walking back to her home, and her arthritis was gone. She could now resume playing tennis, which she had given up, and her dog was hopping around like a little puppy. This is a picture of Mary Clamser. I'm just adding this here because I did some research into lightning strikes. And there are well over 50 documented cases, 50, of people who were struck by lightning and cured of cancer, of paralysis, of muscular dystrophy, of vision problems, a wide variety of conditions. So there's a parallel here. Mind you, I'm not recommending anyone go walking out in a lightning storm because lightning kills people every year. But I think there's a parallel here pointing to we have a lack of knowledge of what the electromagnetic spectrum can do. Now I want to talk very briefly. How much time do I have? I'll wrap this up in 5 minutes.
No, you can keep going. We're not under a time constraint.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear it. But I do want to talk about another aspect of all of this, which is rescues. It's funny to me that the contact experience is portrayed so negatively because that's not what I'm finding in my own research. There are researchers out there who I'm going to put in quotes. I don't think they're researchers. I think they're government agents. There's a very serious problem in this field where this phenomenon, for lack of a better word, the contact experience is being portrayed negatively. And it's simply not true. If you take an objective look at the onboard experience, it's very positive. People are healed. They're taken to the engine room, shown how the engine works, to an observation deck, shown amazing sights of star fields and planets and the Earth and you name it. They'll take you up to the control room and actually teach you how to fly the craft. I wrote a whole book about this, about a contactee by the name of Dolly Safran, Symmetry, who experienced several healings, and they taught her how to fly the craft. So my point is the contact experience is very negatively portrayed, and there's a lot of fear and confusion and disinformation surrounding the subject, and it's not warranted, it's not true. And there's many cases of people whose lives were saved, not only medically, but physically. One lady I interviewed, a great witness, she's a real estate broker, changed that career and became a psychiatrist, a very well-educated person. as a young woman, she was in the Watchung Mountains of New Jersey riding a motorcycle when she slid and had an accident. This was a very remote mountain road at night. It was quite cold. No other cars were likely to come by. So this was a serious situation for her because she was fine, but her motorcycle was damaged. This was an old-fashioned motorcycle that had a Kickstarter, not a key ignition. Uh, so the Kickstarter was all bent out of shape and she could not start her motorcycle. And she was really wondering what to do when she says her quote friends showed up. She has vague memories of being on board, several memories of gray type ETs coming into her bedroom as a kid, many close-up UFO sightings, but never had an encounter like this, which was fully conscious. These two figures showed up. She said they looked pretty much human, were wearing skin-tight jumpsuits, had very pale skin, bald heads, but if they were to wear a hat and sunglasses, she said they could have passed for normal on any street in, here on Earth. And she was right next to them, about 4 feet away, and they told her to step back by basically gesturing. They did not speak to her. One of them told her to step back. The other picked up the motorcycle and proceeded to fix the Kickstarter with his hands, straightening it out, which was astonishing. So she watched this. It was very brief, took less than 3 minutes. They stepped back, parked the motorcycle, stepped off to the side of the road, and motioned for her to come forward and get on the motorcycle, which she did. She immediately tried to start it. It started just fine, and she drove off. She never looked back. She didn't see any UFO. She didn't get any messages. She really regrets now not having stayed longer and tried to communicate. But she said, you have to understand, I'd never had an experience like this. I was a little bit frightened, but she credits them with absolutely saving her when she really needed it. And there are so many cases like this. Another really interesting case involved a whole family who got caught in a hurricane while boating in the Pacific. This was a hurricane that had caught more than 50 boats unawares. It came in very quickly. And there was a regatta, sort of a boat race going on at the time. So a lot of people were involved, and all kinds of emergency beacons from various boats were all going off at once, which caused havoc for the Coast Guard and the rescuers trying to find people. Now, the crew of this boat, which is called the Ramtha, were in radio contact with the rescuers, but the rescuers could not find them. They could see the rescuers, but the rescuers could not see them. And that's when this UFO showed up right over their boat. And the rescuers immediately radioed them and said, are you shooting off a flare? We're seeing a big bright light. And they said, no, we didn't shoot off a flare. This looks like a UFO. It's right over our boat. That's us. That's where we are. And they said, okay, we're coming right away. And as soon as they started to come, this UFO vanished. And the rescue ship showed up and pulled the family off this boat, which had been completely swamped. And it sunk about an hour later. So they were absolutely 100% rescued. There's quite a few cases of this sort of thing. Another case, Lillian Richter, she wrote a book about her experiences. She had gone to visit her mother in the Southern California area, high desert, and had a long drive back to Los Angeles. And while she's driving through the desert, trying to get onto the freeway, a UFO showed up and stalled her car. It quite frightened her. She tried for 15 minutes to start the car, and it just wouldn't start. And finally, this craft left, and the car started immediately. She went on her way, and as soon as she got onto the freeway, she saw that all the traffic was blocked. There had been a horrendous multi-vehicle accident, which caused very severe injuries for everyone involved in the accident. She feels absolutely certain that the ETs prevented her or delayed her so that she wouldn't be involved in this accident. I've got a couple of cases of people who are healed, or not healed, rather, it's rescued from drowning. A gentleman from South America was stuck in quicksand. He said little reptilian guys came and pulled him out. Another lady I interviewed directly was a little girl when she fell into a river. She said human-looking ETs showed up and pulled her out of the river. Another case I found in the literature involved a lady who was walking in the Nevada area, and a gentleman approached her and proceeded to assault her. And he was going to do terrible things to her. And that's when a UFO showed up, and he looked up and became incredibly frightened and said, "We need to run." He ran away. She ran towards the UFO because she was much more frightened of this criminal than these ETs. She credits these ETs with saving her from being physically assaulted and worse. So quite a few cases of people being lost as well. Here's just one more I want to speak about. This is a case which took place in Montana, which is a city, Cook City, very well known for snowmobiling. People flock there all over the United States and the world to go snowmobiling. Well, this gentleman was caught in a blizzard when a UFO showed up. Now, he knew his way home. He's very experienced. But this craft seemed to be leading him. And so he followed it. And he knew it wasn't a helicopter, it was completely silent. And so he followed this bright, bright light for several miles until it stopped, and he came upon a group of snowmobilers who had gotten completely lost, and they were in dire straits. They were in a serious condition of hypothermia. And he was able to rescue them and immediately lead them back to civilization before they suffered worse injuries. So I've got case after case of this sort of thing, of people being rescued from falls, car accidents, trauma of various kinds, weather phenomena, you name it. So ETs do have an agenda of healing. It's a big part of the contact experience. It's why people are being pulled on board. It's all about ETs trying to uphold our genetics. I think this is why certain family lines are followed, because they're upholding the best of our genetics, people who are good people who are very profoundly psychic, people who are doing really good work for humanity. And they also will teach and guide. As I mentioned, they will take people down to the engine room and explain in detail how the craft work, and actually give people plans on how to build free energy motors. There's a good dozen cases of this. These are people who have filed patents and built all kinds of inventions. A good example is George Van Tassel, who built what is world famous. It's called the Integratron. The ETs told him that this was a health boosting device which would help slow the aging process. And he was nearly complete with it. When he died, there's some controversy about whether or not he was taken out by government agents, because following his death, all his plans were stolen. And this device was never completed. It's still there today. You can go visit it. I have visited it. It's definitely worth visiting. It's very interesting. But there's one of many, many cases in which people are given really highly technological information. So what I found regarding the contact experience is that it is one of healing. It's one of guiding, teaching, waking people up to their psychic abilities, ETs announcing their presence. And if anyone has any conversation with ETs beyond, "Don't be afraid, we won't hurt you," and they don't have a full panic reaction, because if you're completely afraid, often you will have missing time. ETs are not wanting to scare people, and they will facilitate that because they don't want to cause trauma. But when someone's able to overcome their fear, the ETs will communicate with them. And the message is almost always will be something personal to help people guide their life. Also, something more general that to help the world, whether it's technology, or usually it's warnings against nuclear proliferation. They're very concerned about our use of nuclear material in any capacity. Also, they warn against war and aggression, greed and corruption, the destruction of the environment, and pollution. These are all very positive things which are clearly designed to help humanity reverse its path of self-destruction. I don't think it's any coincidence that the onboard experience ramped up to a huge degree following the atomic era in the late 1940s, where we finally had the ability to destroy all life on this planet, and we had polluted pretty much all of the rivers and lakes and oceans to a degree that was practically irreversible. This is still the most common message given to ETs. So it's my contention, my assessment, not speculation. Don't believe me. Study the firsthand onboard cases yourself, and you will see that ETs do have an agenda of healing and guiding and teaching and warning and waking people up to their psychic abilities and announcing their presence. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you allowing me to share my research. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Excuse me, I've been struggling to talk here a little bit. Yes, I mean, the presentation, we could just listen to you for the next few days. You know, everything is so interesting. Is the cover-up beginning to fall apart a little bit? I know the Air Force is now allowing their pilots to start talking about the UFOs that they've reported over the last 50 years or whatever. So is somebody in the government maybe trying to step out of this cover-up?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. But the cover-up would have to be worldwide. I mean, it's not like
yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
I think the major countries are cooperating to cover this up. It's a policy they've adopted from the beginning. I think it's largely driven by greed, control, power, the suppression of technology, which would interfere with, the oil industry and the energy industry and the pharmaceutical industry, and the insurance industry and the banking industry. So it's not really the mainstream government who's behind the cover-up. It's the highest levels of the military. It's some people within government, certainly, but the intelligence agencies, the military-industrial complex. But we've now reached a point where there's so much evidence that it's absolutely conclusive to anyone who has the courage to objectively examine it. UFOs are real, there's no doubt about it, it's undeniable. So for our governments to deny the validity of this phenomena would make them not credible, irrelevant. They would lose control of the narrative. That's the last thing they want. So there's an army of researchers out there, millions of people having contact. It's not a few thousand, it's millions. 1 in 40, 1 in 50, according to some studies. So it's become a topic that can no longer be ignored, can no longer be denied, pushed aside, covered up, explained away. So basically, our governments are now being forced to play their hand and reveal something. I don't think we're ever going to get open, official disclosure, complete truth and transparency from our governments. I'm quite skeptical about that, but I think it's inevitable at some point the truth will come out because you can't destroy truth, and this is true.
Right. But because of the karmic laws, these entities, they're not going to get involved in our governments and in our societies as a whole.
Correct. And you can find case after case of this where people have asked and the ET said, no, we can't do this. It's up to you. This is why you incarnated here. We can only guide and teach to a certain degree. And if you think about it, it wouldn't help us to be given healing technology because we already have problems with overpopulation and wars and aggression. So if we had the ability to heal something as simple as flesh wounds, soldiers would be sent out into the battlefield, come back, we'd stitch them back up and send them right out again. And we'd have problems with overpopulation. It would likely, we always abuse technology. So ETs do not hand over technology to people. And they've made it very clear it's up to us to solve our own problems. We've made our bed, it's up to us to fix it.
And I know I've heard some conjecture in the past about Are they actually extraterrestrials, or are they some societies that are subterranean on Earth that coexist with us and but well below the surface of the Earth? Did you have any information on that aspect of where they may be from?
I think we've got a pretty good handle on it. There's a lot of speculation out there. People are saying, oh, they're time travelers from the future. No, I scoured the literature looking for cases to support that. I found one or two that are somewhat questionable. And you have to look at the totality of the evidence to figure out what's going on here. Don't think they're time travelers from the future. People say, well, maybe they're interdimensional beings who put on different masks. And they point to all these fairies and gnomes and little people and Bigfoot and ghosts and so forth and lump them all into one phenomena, which I do not subscribe to this theory. I think that people are seeing extraterrestrials in the classic sense. And if you talk to the contactees, many of them have gotten very extensive information, very extensive experiences where they've been taken to other planets. I think we're dealing with people very much like us, who are very psychically advanced, morally, ethically, technologically advanced. And people say, well, maybe they're interdimensional. Well, yes, but here's the thing. Humans are interdimensional. We have a soul. We survive life after death. The evidence for life after death is very strong. All entities have interdimensional aspects to them. I don't think it's useful to label these guys as interdimensional because, frankly, we all are interdimensional and it doesn't preclude them from being extraterrestrials. And I can tell you, while there are some researchers who are saying, oh, they're demonic. No, I've got books behind me on everything I could find on demonology. That is a real phenomena, but it follows a wholly different pattern. It's a spiritual manifestation. Demons do not ride around in craft and implant people. When people are taken on board, they're missing from their rooms. There's every reason to know that this is a physical experience. And I do not label them as interdimensional beings or demonic or a phenomena that wears different masks. And if you talk to the investigators who specialize in this subject, onboard experiences, and if you talk to the contactees themselves, the vast majority of them have come to this conclusion that we are dealing with people very much like us. And in fact, the ETs will tell them over and over again, we share a common heritage. We have genetics just like you. The reason we look different is because of ancestry. We have a common heritage. They say, we are you, you are us. We are all one. So this is a very important and very consistent aspect of UFO contact. All cases, almost without exception, involve humanoids. The humanoid form is the universal template. They are people like us. And another good argument is the fact that we here are physical beings living on a planet. We know this. It makes absolute perfect sense that there would be other people out there. And it makes zero sense that there wouldn't be. And that's exactly what the evidence is showing us.
That's fantastic. Even to think that these people can traverse light years and light years and light years of space to visit us here on Earth. So their technology has to be very extreme, more than we could recognize. Is there any connection that researchers that look into ancient aliens that actually may have helped in engineering and things thousands of years ago?
To some extent, there's no doubt that ETs have been around for millennia. Since we started recording history, we have evidence of this, whether it's stone carvings or petroglyphs or the hieroglyphs of Egypt or the Sanskrit writings in ancient India or medieval writings. I mean, Romans were well aware of UFOs. They called them flying shields. The extraterrestrial explanation wasn't super popular throughout the Middle Ages. It was much more viewed as a religious phenomena. But if you look at, various megalithic monuments, like the Great Pyramids, for a simple example, Pyramid of Giza is located, the latitude and longitude is the speed of light. It really is. This is not a joke. Look it up. There are mathematics and all kinds of knowledge built into a lot of these megalithic monuments around the world because apparently our planet goes through various iterations and calamities. And we're facing one right now where our sun is very unstable and we're facing basically a massive coronal mass ejection, which is going to basically knock down the Earth's energy grid and wreak havoc. So this is a message a lot of contactees have gotten, and you can see this in some of the megalithic monuments.
Um, hmm. Have there been any cases of maybe somebody reverse engineering some of the apparatus, or some of the things to say like equipment the ETs have used to do healings?
To some extent, I mean, there are cases of crash retrievals. It's not just Roswell or the Aztec or Kecksburg or the Paradise Valley crash in Arizona. These are cases that come from all over the world, and there's a lot of them. And in some of these cases, technology has, some of it has been removed from craft, some healing devices, which allegedly can find tumors perhaps, or stitch wounds, or reverse age or slow down aging to a certain degree. And absolutely, we have well over, well, close to 1,000 whistleblowers who have talked about reverse engineering of ET tech to a degree. I don't think we have necessarily the ability to travel other star systems or anything like that. I don't have a whole lot of great reporting on that. But some craft flying around, particularly now, most of them are our own. The TR-3B would be a good example. Triangular craft, I think, are often pointed to as being reverse engineered craft. I've talked to some whistleblowers personally. Yes, we absolutely do have ET technology, but these ETs are not hundreds of thousands of years ahead of us. It's more along the lines of millions of years. So these craft are flown psychically, almost without exception, and we just are not at that ability. Some of them are built in higher dimensions. So we're not going to be able to reverse engineer a craft to the degree that the ETs are able to build them.
And you have not had your own encounter.
Yes, yes, I have.
Okay.
I am going to have to leave here in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So just so you know, but yes, I have had my own encounter starting shortly after I began researching this subject, which is a pattern. If you start researching the subject, you're much more likely to be noticed by the ETs. I did have a missing time encounter in 1992 when I was 27 years old, where an orb came down in front of my car and I stopped. It went back and forth right in front of my windshield and darted up. That's all I remember. I don't remember driving home. In fact, I forgot the whole incident. And it wasn't long after that I started having a number of very close sightings, some involving telepathy, being told like when my niece would be born or that this contactee is telling the truth. Started having dreams of being on board and eventually did have a fully conscious onboard encounter where I was laid out on a table. They didn't really, they briefly examined me, but I got up, I saw a very tall gray. It turned out this was the ETs that a contactee I interviewed, Dolly Safran, who I wrote a book about symmetry. This was the people that she's in touch with. So that occurred on my birthday 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Uh, so that was a really amazing encounter and incredibly benevolent.
Yeah, excuse me. So Preston, it is just unbelievably interesting. I'm almost looking forward to my encounter. If I start pursuing this on a daily basis, as you said, maybe I'll have an encounter. I want to thank you very much for the presentation. It was extraordinary. It was lengthy. I'm sorry you had to talk that long. But I loved it. It was one of the best presentations we've had. So thank you very much. And to everybody else listening, we'll have another presentation next Tuesday at 7 p.m. I'm sorry to cut this short, but I'm just having a hard time talking to you all. So thank you again, Preston, and good night.
Pleasure and honor. Thank you.